Hello, I'm Melissa Coates. Are you the go-to person for Power BI in your organization? Then you know just how much there is to keep up with when overseeing a well-managed Power BI environment. One of those topics is workspace planning. What you're about to see is a sample module from my online course called Power BI Deployment and Governance. This course has 16 sections end to end. The one we're previewing today is within Section 10, which is focused on content management, distribution, and deployment. There are a number of modules within Section 10. The one we're focusing on for this sample module is Workspace Purpose, Scope, and Organization. It's the first of 3 modules that are devoted to the topic of workspace planning. Enjoy the preview of this sample module. In this module, we're going to start the discussion about the ever-popular topic of workspace planning. We have several modules related to workspaces, and this one starts off with thinking about it from the perspective of scope and organization, including the 4 main criteria for workspace planning. Before we get too far, let's clarify a few terms that we're going to use to reduce ambiguity. By the way, I didn't make these up based on how I see the world. These terms come directly from the Power BI team. The term sharing can be used 2 ways. It can refer to the actual feature in the Power BI service where we share one artifact with a group or a user. The term is also often used very generally, as in, I'll share that report with you, when really the actual method could be one of several ways. The term distribution is a general term that refers to the delivery of content for others to consume. We often like to say that an app is a good way to distribute content to a large audience. Collaboration is a general term for when people work together. This could be done by alternating who works on a Power BI desktop file, or it could be done in a workspace when people are collaborating to create and test content. The primary purpose for a workspace is the storage of content. That is, the storage of artifacts like datasets and reports. But it's more than that. Another primary purpose of a workspace is to facilitate collaboration. Here I'm depicting responsibility for the dataset and reports being with 2 people. The best way to do this is to publish separate PBIX files to the service, or they could go back and forth sharing a PBIX file. The third person shown is a tester helping with data validations or quality assurance or user acceptance testing. A secondary purpose of a workspace is to distribute or deliver content for small teams. Here I'm depicting using the workspace for viewing content without an app for the moment. As we talked about in the previous module, if you're trying to use PBIX files on a file system for viewers, that's a pretty hard thing to do well. So at this point, we know workspaces are really important for collaboration and distribution. Now we can start thinking about the criteria for workspace planning. We have 4 sets of interrelated criteria to think about while we are doing workspace planning. First, what is the content? Second, who's the content delivered to? Third, how will the content be managed and by whom? And fourth, how will the content be deployed? There are several approaches that we can take for governing workspaces. If we do this right, we can really help make the user experience better. You may or may not take the position that all workspaces follow the criteria I'm about to describe. If your organization is massive and you have hundreds or thousands of workspaces, then you may end up with only a certain set of workspaces being governed, kind of like the Tier 1 content that we talked about in the data governance section. I don't usually refer to workspaces as Tier 1, but you could if you wanted to. I've also heard them referred to as managed workspaces. Now let's explore these 4 criteria further. First, what is the content? Here we are considering the subject area, topic, and purpose. We don't want it to be too broad because then we could end up with a huge number of artifacts in the workspace, which is hard to use. We don't want it to be too narrow because then we end up with a lot of workspaces with very few artifacts in them. We also want to think about how sensitive the content is because If it's highly sensitive, then we're more likely to segregate it on its own. In that case, another new workspace is usually worth the trade-off. Second, who's the content delivered to? For our subject area, we need to think about the content delivery scope for our target audience because this forms a security boundary. We also have to consider the license mode for the workspace, which is either Pro, PPU, or one of the two types of premium capacity, because this has a big impact on who's able to access the workspace as well as the features that are available. Here's where we also want to think about our intentions for distributing via an app. Sometimes we back into the scope of a workspace because of the app scope and permissions that we want to end up with, and more on that in a few moments. Third, how will the content be managed and by whom? Here we're thinking about content ownership and management. If all artifacts in the workspace are managed by a decentralized team, for instance. We also think about the type of content, particularly if we're going to separate data workspaces from reporting workspaces, which we'll talk more about in a couple of modules. There is a 10 gig size limit per workspace in shared capacity to be aware of here as well. And fourth, how will the content be deployed? Our final criteria is where we also think about if we need separate workspaces for development, test, and production. We want to think about these ALM needs. This is important because frequently content is deployed collectively as a group. We might deploy individually, manually, with deployment pipelines, with REST APIs, or even with Azure DevOps pipelines. It's also a good time to think about other specific needs, such as data sovereignty. That is, we need to store the data in a certain place geographically, and that would require the multi-geo feature available with premium capacity. Part of criteria number 2 we just covered was about the app distribution and how it can influence us backing into the scope for a workspace. And that's relevant because there's a one-to-one relationship. Every workspace can have one app. However, there's an item on the release plan that states artifact level access is coming. As of now, it's targeted for public preview in March 2022. I think this is going to be a pretty big deal. The way I understand it, we'll be able to have different versions of an app within the same workspace. We'll be able to mix and match what workspace artifacts are in a collection and set the permissions for that collection to different users and security groups. If you've ever had to set up multiple workspaces to accommodate a scenario like that, I think the feature on the roadmap will help. Although it won't technically be multiple apps per workspace, my impression is that it'll accomplish the same thing. One place a lot of people start is having one workspace per department, and that does work sometimes. However, that can turn into something that's way too broad. Since we have no folders, if we get past a certain number of artifacts, it gets very unwieldy. So our goal is to have a workspace structure that's just right, not too broad and not too narrow, based on the criteria that we just reviewed. Let's take a look at a demo of how you might organize content and some ideas for naming. If we take a look at our workspace list here, there are a few things that I want to call your attention to. One way that we can organize our different workspaces is by topic. So here are several workspaces where sales is a common topic. Therefore, a consistent prefix is being used to sort these all together, and also a consistent workspace image is being used. We can also see here that I've separated out the sales data workspace from some other workspaces which I would consider to be reporting workspaces. We can organize the workspaces by development, test, and production. And I also tend to drop the suffix from a production workspace just so it's a little bit cleaner. We might also group workspaces based on who owns or supports the content. So for instance, common data indicates that the corporate BI team owns and manages that. And that's what the blue shield is intended to represent. This is content owned and managed by the corporate BI team. We could think about who has access to the content. And in this example, the content here is publicly accessible via publish to web. And so I've actually indicated as such in the workspace name. And if we take a look at a workspace here, this is Sales Analytics. We've got the workspace ID in the workspace URL. From a technical perspective, you can always feel free to rename a workspace because the ID stays the same even if you change the name. You may, however, want to inform your users, though, if you're going to change the name. The URL has groups in the path rather than workspace in the path, just due to the first version of workspaces being related to Microsoft 365 groups. Let's wrap up this module with a review of a few tips for naming workspaces. We saw a few of these on the demo as well. A prefix works well to sort similar content together, like the sales examples shown here. Consistently using an image as well can also be really helpful to recognize content. A suffix is most commonly used to denote development and test workspaces. If a production workspace was created by a deployment pipeline, my personal preference is to update the workspace name to remove that production suffix that got auto-generated so that the production workspace has a cleaner name. I wish the term owner was not used this way, but the Power BI service displays the workspace name under the owner column in several places, like the Shared with Me page and the Workspace page. We talk more about the topic of owners in the Content Ownership Approaches module. To avoid confusion, it's usually best to keep the name of the app and the workspace pretty similar to each other. They can be a little different, though, if it helps usability for the consumers. We don't usually need to include the word workspace in the workspace name. I also don't see a need to include Power BI in a workspace name, though I've seen that more often than I would like. We also don't usually need to include our organization name, though it is possible if we're targeting external users that could be helpful to them. 2 tips here related to data flows. Since Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 auto-generates its folder structure behind data flows, there can be issues if we have slashes in our workspace names. So avoid that in your naming convention. For data flows, the workspace name and the data flow name, then the table name, are all part of the discovery process when a dataset author is searching for a data flow in Power BI Desktop. So you might give that some thought when you're naming things. And this one is mostly just food for thought. If you have highly restricted content that needs to be audited a specific way, you might include that as part of the name, like an R suffix in the example here that indicates restricted content. The big downside to this is that if something does go wrong with the access, it brings attention to the content. As an alternative, some organizations also keep additional workspace metadata in something like a SharePoint list. If guest users are a rare circumstance, and there's a situation where they are accessing pretty confidential data, you might end up with a situation like the example shown where you have 2 workspaces, one that contains content for internal users only, and one that contains content that the guest users can view. The goal here is to be really explicit about what's stored where, mostly to help whomever is managing and publishing the content, but also possibly for internal consumers who might need to know which of the 2 workspaces to find something. Along the same lines, if you have some content that's being made available publicly using Publish to Web, indicating as such in the workspace name can be really helpful. I tend to like having the word data in a workspace name to indicate its purpose is to house data sets and/or data flows. Everything else would then be considered a reporting workspace. Not a perfect system, but it can work. If you find yourself trying to set up a naming convention for workspaces, be realistic as to what you'll really be able to achieve. In a self-service platform like Power BI, we can't always be as clean as we want. If we provide our content authors and owners a set of examples with a recommended naming convention, that can be helpful. Also, as people see what's used in Power BI, it will often end up becoming the de facto standard. See you on the next module. I hope you enjoyed this sample module about workspace planning. If you liked this content, I would love to have you join us. In addition to the video recordings, we regularly hold live Q&A calls. There are customizable templates and recommended action items to help save you time. And you get access to everything for 6 months, so you can jump on Q&A or check back for updates as things change over time. Thanks for watching.